Welcome everyone. We're gonna go ahead and get started. My name is Alyssa Fink, and I'm the president of the board of the Phius Alliance Southwest chapter. And I'm really excited to welcome you all to our annual meeting and webinar on how to debunk myths about high-performance buildings for Practical Toolkit. Here's a really quick overview of what we're planning to cover in the next hour. I'll provide a brief overview of who we are and what we do as Phius Alliance Southwest, in case any of you have not had the chance to get acquainted with us yet. Then we'll hear from our guest speaker, Dr. Gale Sinatra, who will share some science-based tools for combating misinformation. Then we'll flip over to a panel format, and a couple of Phius Alliance Southwest board members, Tom Hootman and Sophie Martin, will talk about a couple high-performance building myths they've run into in their work, and they'll work with Gale to workshop some effective ways to debunk them. Then we'll have a few minutes for questions, and we'll conclude with a reflection on our first year as a chapter, provide updates on current chapter activities and opportunities, and look towards what's ahead. Now, a little bit about who we are as a chapter. The Phius Alliance is the membership arm of Phius, a nonprofit 501c3 organization committed to decarbonizing the built environment by making high-performance passive building the mainstream market standard. And as the Southwest chapter of the Phius Alliance, our goal is to support the growing community of passive building professionals, like many of you, in Arizona, Colorado, New Mexico, and Utah. And without further ado, I'm thrilled to welcome our guest speaker, Dr. Gale Sinatra. I'm very grateful that she agreed to join us today, because there's been a lot of talk recently within the passive building and building science communities about the myths and misinformation that we encounter in our work. And we don't have to handle these things alone, because there are a number of wonderful people doing important work on effective science communication and science education that we can look to for insights. And Gale is one of them. Here's the bio that she provided, which I'll read, and then we'll get started. Dr. Gale M. Sinatra is the Stephen H. Crocker Chair and Distinguished Professor of Psychology and Education at the Rossier School of Education at the University of Southern California, and a member of the National Academy of Education. She received her BS, MS, and PhD in psychology from the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. Sinatra heads the Motivated Change Research Lab at USC, the mission of which is understanding the cognitive, motivational, and emotional processes that lead to attitude change, conceptual change, and successful STEM learning. Her recent research is in climate change education and communication, and her co-authored book, which I have a copy of here, with Dr. Barbara Hofer, a psychologist of Middlebury College in Vermont, is entitled Science Denial, Why It Happens and What to Do About It. Thank you, Gale, again, so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much for having me, Alyssa, and everyone in the organization. I am a psychologist, as Alyssa mentioned, and I'm going to talk about science communication challenges and solutions for addressing misinformation and what psychology tells us about that. But I also do have to share a personal, relevant piece of information, and that is I am a victim of the Eaton Canyon wildfire in Altadena, California in January 2025, where I and about 20,000 other people lost their homes in Altadena. There was also two other fires at the same time. And my neighbors, several of my neighbors, are building passive houses as they try to rebuild in their community. So that's something to keep in mind, that passive housing is something that's very important in our community. All right, so on to my talk today. Well, actually, we all need to make informed decisions about scientific issues. And I like this example from 2020 in April during COVID. You can see this beach border between two counties in Florida that had different stay-at-home policies, and it shows a literal line in the sand. And it shows to me that how people understand science impacts how They enact their scientific understanding, and that makes a real world difference. So Alyssa's already mentioned my book, and in the book we talk about science, doubt, denial, and resistance. And I want to go through what each of these mean. But first, I do want to note something very important, and that is we're all susceptible, and we've probably all fallen for some of these constraints. It's not an us or them issue. There's not like a group of science deniers and a group of people who are not science deniers. I'll explain a little bit more about that. Starting with denial. Fortunately, denial is pretty rare. It is not the most common. It's a belief-based stance and a rejection of evidence. So you might see someone saying that climate change is a hoax, or that the earth is flat, or that vaccines cause autism. What's much more common, and something we can all sort of fall into, is what we call cafeteria denial. And this is when people choose what to believe and what to deny. Doubt and resistance is probably the most common, and people do this when findings of a research study don't fit with their personal beliefs or conflict with their social identity or require deeper analysis that they're just not really interested in doing. One thing that's also important to remember is that doubt and resistance can be manufactured by, for example, vested interest. I would recommend everybody read this book, Merchants of Doubt by Naomi Oreskes and Eric Conway, where they describe how the tobacco executives depicted in this picture here on the top testified in front of Congress that, tobacco, may or may not be harmful, probably wasn't, creating doubt. And this really has persisted as a playbook. And now fossil fuel industry and many other science doubters and deniers have used this playbook to cast doubt in the minds of the public. We can see it now, very evident in vaccine safety. I do want to point out that skepticism is normal, healthy part of scientific process. And that only becomes problematic when people become skeptical of all scientific findings, and then it's not so great. In our book, we talk about a lot of challenges for science understanding, and I've picked out a few today that are relevant to your topic of interest, which is confronting mis and disinformation. So I'm going to talk about these conceptual challenges, the digital media environment that is rife with mis and disinformation, what's controversial and how we talk about controversies, motivated reasoning, I'll explain what that is, and the role of identity, emotions, and attitudes. So, starting with some of the conceptual challenges, science is complex, and I'm sure your field is complex. So what happens is that it's difficult to communicate complexity without dumbing down the message. And that's something that we all have to think about. How can we communicate exactly what you mean to communicate about a complex socio-scientific issue, in other words, an issue that affects us in society, with an appreciation for that complexity, but without dumbing it down? That's a challenge. A lot of people use metaphors, and that can be very helpful, like the double helix. Another conceptual challenge is that psychologically, we rely on two different systems of thinking called System 1 and System 2 in psychology. System 1 is that quick intuitive judgment that we often make, whereas System 2 is the more deeper analytical judgment. And because we have these two kinds of systems, we can fall prey to biases and heuristics. So an example of a bias is that we can interpret information that is consistent with our existing beliefs easier. We remember that more than inconsistent information. An example of a heuristic is that we sometimes can believe information that's just been made available to us. So an example here is this is Senator Inhofe from the great state of Oklahoma holding up a snowball on the Senate floor because it had just snowed unexpectedly, creating a big storm they called Snowmageddon. And the snowball confirmed his previous bias, and it was available to him. And he tried to say that, well, the snow proves that climate change isn't real. The digital environment of mis and disinformation. How do we make sense of science claims in this digital world we now all live in? Science denial is far from new. We can think back to Galileo, who tried to explain that the Earth was not the center of the universe, and it didn't go well for him. But now, science denial is amplified through social media. And there's a tremendous amount of information out there, and as well, mis and disinformation. The film Don't Look Up tried to portray that situation in a both comical and sad way. How do people decide what knowledge to accept as valid that they find online? Well, it turns out people are much more likely to believe science articles when they are posted by a friend on Facebook than if they read them directly from expert sources. That's great if your friends are all experts in the area you're looking for information in, but it's not great because we all live in these social media bubbles. And, this creates an erosion of trust and expertise that's been really decades in happening in our country. So what happens is you get this giant gap on so many issues between what scientists believe to be true based on evidence and what the public's views are. The public believes that it's not very safe to eat GMOs, whereas scientists overwhelmingly believe that it is safe. Climate change is due to human activity, according to science, but the public is very 50-50 on that. And then scientists definitely overwhelmingly agree that vaccine benefits outweigh the risks, and public is not too sure about that either. So herein lies the problem. They're getting a lot of mis and disinformation from social media that creates these misconceptions, these misunderstandings. And the problem with misconceptions about any topic is they're sticky. And what that means is people hold on to them and they're very hard to get them unstuck. There used to be something called the deficit hypothesis in psychology, meaning people just had a deficit of knowledge. They didn't understand it. And that was attributing to these misconceptions. But that just isn't true, because simply adding knowledge to people doesn't overcome the misconceptions. Instead, they have to be directly refuted. Now I'm going to explain some of the techniques that people use effectively to refute misinformation and misconceptions. Also, it's important to understand that misinformation, misconceptions, they are associated with very negative attitudes and emotions, which makes them even harder to upend. And refuting those can help. Refuting the misconceptions can help. Controversies. What's controversial to lay people is not necessarily controversial to scientists, and scientists and professionals in a field don't necessarily know what is controversial to lay people. So it's important for you when you're communicating about your field to explain what you know and how you know it, and what is not known and why it is not yet known. So that's really important. And it's very important to avoid both sidesism. Journalists love balance, But balance is not the way to go when you're communicating about a settled scientific issue. A good example, well, it's a bad example. A good example of what not to do is from this Wall Street Journal opinion page article. Is the Earth is warming, but is it CO2 that's really the cause? Well, a lot of people don't go on to read the article. And so what this does is it raises doubt. And the takeaway message, if you just look at this, is that scientists don't really know what's causing climate change. And that's very misleading. Back to the balance issue. Journalists love balance, and they love to put things in, a 50-50. If someone says this, well, someone else says that in an effort to be fair and balanced. But balanced reporting results in confusion, especially when an issue has been pretty well resolved. So, for example, humans are contributing to the climate crisis. And if you put on, Bill Nye, the science guy, to debate that, here he's debating evolution, but same thing, it gives disproportionate visibility to the denialist, and it leads to this manufactured doubt we were talking about, and it exploits uncertainty. And, science isn't about a debate. Now, of course, it's about debates, as in issues that are being resolved, but you don't resolve them through a rhetorical debate. You resolve them through evidence. Motivated reasoning. So, motivated reasoning is when we individuals are motivated to come to a preferred conclusion, but not necessarily an accurate one. And this is something that we all may do. And we don't necessarily know we're doing it. We sometimes feel like we are being very, very careful in our analysis of information. And we don't even realize that we're leaning towards the outcome that we really want. So this both sidesism we talked about is definitely not good, because that can create the opportunity to strengthen the individual's original position. So in other words, if they hear both sides, they're much more likely to stick with what they already know. An important thing for communicating about your field is to know what are the motivations that allow for tailored communication and hopefully create less misconceptions. Oops, went back too far. Finally, I'm trying to be quick here so we can get to the fun part where we talk about the relevant content of your area. Finally, we're talking about identity, emotions, and attitudes. Social identity is a huge factor in how people understand anything, particularly science. Your group membership influences your views of science. Individuals tend to conform to the attitudes and views of their group, and communication messages from in-group members are much more persuasive than out-group members. I'll give you an example. During COVID, did you think that Dr. Fauci was a hero or a villain? Well, people decided that based on what their in-group thought. And sense of identity and self is tied up with those beliefs. So, for example, if you identify with a group that questions vaccines or mask wearing during a pandemic, you're much more likely to also raise those questions. What can you do about social identity? Well, you can't change people's social identity, but everyone, all of us, have multiple identities. What you can do in communications is, because we know in-group messages are more effective, you can change the in-group. So here's an example of how we did that in a water conservation study in Pasadena, California. If you're a homeowner you often receive information about how much water you are consuming and how much you're consuming relative to your neighbors. And this is also called deficit framing. What happens when you do this is often people will look and say, hey, my neighbor is using more than me. I'm going to go take a 10-minute shower. So it doesn't usually decrease water consumption. So what we did is we compared that typical informational framing. You just didn't know enough. We're just going to tell you more information, to something called social identity framing, where we invoked an identity that people may not be thinking about. And that identity was conservation of water. So we said in this communication, we Southern Californians, we conserve water. So using a lot of we language and identify them as Southern Californians or people who can care about conservation of water. And what happened in this study is we actually measured their water consumption, and we found that people who received this framing of social identity were reduced their water consumption even over a hot summer month. Emotions and attitudes about controversial issues tend to run negative. What happens when you have misconceptions about an issue, you have negative attitudes and emotions. In my research team, we do a lot to confront both the misinformation, misconception, and the negativity associated with negative attitudes and emotions. In this study, we were addressing misconceptions about GMOs. What we did was refute those, and I'm going to explain in a minute some of our methods of doing that. And the refutation of this misinformation reduced the negative emotions and the negative attitudes, and those are often linked, emotions and attitudes. So this reduction created a shift in the emotional and attitudinal valence. So why is this important? Well, people who have really negative attitudes are resistors. They're resistant to hearing your message. So I'm going to skip this real quick, but just to say the relationship between emotions and attitudes and conceptions is interesting. You can have accurate conceptions about a topic or inaccurate conceptions, but you also can have either negative or positive attitudes. And in my research, what we focus on is this box right here, where someone has inaccurate information and negative attitudes, because we find if we can correct the misinformation, often we can shift the attitudes as well. Okay, so now the moment you've all been waiting for. How do you do this? Well, I'm going to talk about 4 different important things. 1, sourcing, and then 3 strategies for confronting misinformation: pre-bunking, debunking, and refuting. Sourcing information. Well, everyone's getting their information online, so they need to know how to source accurate information online. This is an instructional article we wrote for teachers to teach sourcing to students. I have a large grant right now where we're doing this across several states with thousands of kids, and we can teach this to middle schoolers. But to be honest, these strategies are important for all ages, including adults. And quickly, these strategies are to stop, step back, and really think, employing that system 2 that I was talking about, the deliberative reasoning. When you see an article, don't just share it immediately. Next, become a fact checker. And the strategy we encourage is something fact checkers use called lateral reading. So when you Google something, you read down the page. And as you read down, you're probably encountering more and more misinformation as you go. Instead of reading down the page, what fact checkers do when they open an article, they immediately open a new window. That's the lateral part. They open a new window and they do some research on that source. Who is this source? Is this someone trying to sell something? Is it a reputable source? Do other people believe this information to be true, etc.? Once you've found out more about the source, then you want to make a judgment about the claim that's made in the article, and then evaluate that evidence relative to the claim. So this sounds really complicated and hard to do, but like I said, we teach this to middle schoolers. They learn how to do it in a couple of weeks. And once you learn how to do it, you can actually do it in a couple of minutes. Now, pre-bunking. So pre-bunking is a strategy that has been researched mostly by a researcher from the UK, Sander van der Linden, his name is. I love that name. That's why I throw it in there. Pre-bunking is about stopping misinformation before it starts. Remember, I said misinformation is sticky. So the best thing to do would be to stop it before it starts. And what he does is he exposes people to a weakened dose of the misinformation. And you can see that he uses this medical metaphor. What he says is you're preempting it by creating cognitive antibodies in an attempt to inoculate people against the misinformation. So here's an example. You may hear in the next few weeks that wearing masks causes language delays in young children. So this is a research study he did at the beginning of COVID when this misinformation was about to come out. And he says, yes, some language delays have been observed, but this is an example of a spurious correlation. And then he goes on to explain what the real evidence is. And he also goes on to explain what's a spurious correlation. So this technique includes a forewarning. You may hear this misinformation coming up soon. A refutation. You rebut the information, the misinformation. An explanation of the correct information, and also an explanation of misinformation techniques. So a misinformation spreader often does something like cherry picks information, picking one study, for example. This article in Nature explains how this works in a lot of detail if you're interested. Next, debunking. This is the debunking handbook, and if you have the opportunity to take a picture of the QR code, you can download it. If not, later on, just Google debunking handbook. It comes right up. This is the a very useful guide. It's been I was part of the team that did this. It translates all the research into easy to use methods. It talks about the stickiness of misinformation and about trying to prevent it from getting stuck in the first place. It explains how to debunk, and it explains why the misinformation is false. The debunking handbook talks about something like called the fact sandwich, which you've probably heard of before. In communications, lead with a fact, warn about the myth that's coming, explain why that myth is misleading, and finish by reinforcing the facts. Refuting. This is the research program that I've spent most of my time on in this area. We use something called a refutation text, which again follows that similar format. We state the misconception, and this is when people already have it, and we know they have it. We state the misconception, we directly refute the misconception, we explain the scientifically valid position. And it's important in these communications to not say, you are wrong, you are incorrect, because people don't love to hear that. So what we say instead is, some people believe the recent changes in global average temperatures are due to natural causes alone. However, scientists believe this is incorrect. Then you go on to explain the correct information. We had an NSF-funded research study called a meta-analysis, where we reviewed all these studies. These are some of the ones we've done. We've used this technique for climate change, the greenhouse effect, GMOs, even the issue of scientific uncertainty. And what this meta-analysis showed was looking at dozens and dozens of studies using this refutation format. It was very effective in confronting misinformation. Now, some people worry about what's called the backfire effect. The backfire effect is when you refute misinformation, some people double down on their original idea. In other words, it backfires. They believe their original idea even more. Research has showed that that's rare, and it does happen, but only in a small number of people. Okay, now, when should you refute and when should you not refute? So we would say refute misinformation when it's confirmed that it's misinformation. Obviously, you want to be sure about that. Refute when it's evidence is very much supporting and very clear. Definitely refute if the misinformation is dangerous or harmful, as it was during COVID when people were talking about ineffective and dangerous cures. But we definitely say don't refute if an issue is unresolved, because maybe there's something still on the fence about it. So that might not be the best time to refute. If the evidence is just tentative, also not really a good time to refute. Definitely not if it's a matter of opinion. We use refutations for scientific information that is incorrect out there that we're trying to overcome. And if your goal is persuasion, that's a different technique, but we could talk about persuasion. All right, so to wrap up, so we have plenty of time for misinformation and misconceptions in your area. What are the key points? You can pre-bunk, debunk, and refute, and you should. Make sure you're providing explanations. It's not enough to tell people the information is wrong. You have to tell them what is right and why it's right. Definitely be clear about what is controversial and what is not controversial. Reduce complexity, but be thoughtful about not dumbing down. And you want to trigger positive emotions with your communication while you reduce negative emotions. Negative emotions and attitudes create resistance to your message and resistance to the content. In our book, we provide a lot more information than I was able to share today about action steps for individual people, for educators in K-12 and higher ed, for policymakers, for science communicators. So real quickly, what can science communicators do? Write about science for the general public. You probably know that the number of local newspapers has dwindled, and the number of science articles in newspapers in general has also dwindled, and there's not enough communication out there about science for the general public. Again, it's important to write about what scientists know as much as what they don't know, and to know your audience, which is always a good writing instruction, but what you need to know about your audience is what misconceptions they have, what motivations they have, what are their attitudes towards the topic, what are their emotions, and importantly, what are their identities. And make sure you provide the evidence for your claims and keep the both sides for opinions, not for science. Thanks.
Thank you, Gale, for sharing that introduction on science communication and how to combat misinformation. I have some questions. I'm sure there's people in the audience with some questions. What I'm going to ask is that if you have questions, please hold on to them for just a few moments. And what we're going to do now is I'm going to turn the floor over to Tom Hootman and Sophie Martin, who are two people on the Phius Alliance Southwest board and are passive building practitioners. They'll talk about a few common pieces of misinformation that they've run into in their work, and then facilitate some conversation about how can we apply all these things that you just talked about, Gale, to some of those specific examples. So I'll go ahead and pass it over to you, Tom and Sophie. Thank you.
I will go ahead and share my screen. You guys see the PowerPoint slide? Nice. Okay, Tom, I have you on deck first.
Yeah. Well, first, thanks, Gale. Wonderful. I've taken a lot of notes, and I actually now started to think of different ones that would be good to kind of pose as far as like, I think both Sophie and I are going to talk about stuff that we face in the trenches, like with design teams. But I think there's, as I think about your presentation and larger biases within the, like how you actually get people and owners actually get sort of interested in high performance building or passive house in general, is still a challenge. But yeah, so this is one that I had posed that we could kind of workshop a little bit and have a discussion about. Sophie has a really good one too. So one that I encounter a lot with either the contractors, the architects and whatnot, but the triple pane windows, well, so the fact is, triple pane windows add a lot of value to projects, particularly in cold climates. And what I hear regularly, the misconception is like, well, they're not cost effective. And I think where this stems from mostly is the experience with. I mean, they are more expensive, and you're there. Often past projects they've done just maybe a simple payback, looking at a short time span, and haven't really captured the true value of the triple pane windows. I guess the question is, how do you actually capture that value to the team when they're making these decisions, when the value is more complex, right? It involves the potential of the triple pane windows to, of course, save energy over the whole life of the window, 50 years, 60 years, not 10 or 20. And has the value of reducing HVAC sizing and the cost of that, and potentially even removing systems like perimeter heat. There's a value of improved thermal comfort, which doesn't necessarily come with a dollar value through warmer surfaces on the glass, so less radiant discomfort and drafts, and reduced condensation risks, so the durability of the facades over time because of the increased indoor glass temperature. So that's what I'm posing. Is that, and maybe others of you on the call have had to tackle this one on projects too. And maybe as a way to get into it, I was kind of thinking about where maybe the 5 challenges and where the audiences might be lying. I think I kind of thought motivated reasoning is maybe what's in action here, but maybe there's more to it. The
Yeah,
architect has
I
been,
definitely have some thoughts. Like it's like you said, it's complicated, and I did talk about complexity. And so if you can think of ways to break down the complexity, we talked about maybe using metaphors. I'm sure there's a metaphor for um, triple pane windows. I don't know what it is right now, but I'm sure you can think of one. Another thing is that what we see when we're teaching students about sourcing, what comes up a lot is somebody's just trying to sell me something. And of course, you are trying to sell something. So I would consider evoking some trusted communicators. So homeowners who already have the triple pane windows, employing them to communicate about the advantage that they have seen. So, you can leverage a trusted in-group member.
yeah, if that makes sense. A metaphor would, I need to give that some thought, because that could go a long way. I could see that, and I think it helps it get sticky. Like it makes it sticky, like in a good way, right?
Right. And,
For the
I'm
team.
sure there's, a metaphor in maybe in nature of, I don't know.
Yeah,
You can think of
yeah,
one, I'm sure, if you give it some thought.
yeah.
But I
Give it a little thought.
definitely feel that that it's complicated and people probably don't understand. Also, the long-term issue, where the benefit really plays out in long term, is probably a challenge as well. As you know, people are much more short-term oriented in their thinking than long-term oriented. And so that's something I think you have to sort of fold into your communication strategy, is thinking about how to convey the long-term benefit.
Yeah.
And
How about ways of simplifying? Because it is complicated. I mean, I guess that those things like having a trusted communicator or, an alternative source that could be trusted and maybe, but other ways of simplifying, because it does get complicated as some of these decisions do.
yeah, a method that I found more effective for, selling ideas like this is if you have an energy model on your project and you can plug those triple pane windows into the energy model, plug a double pane window into the energy model, and you can actually show whoever it is you're trying to convince, designer, your owner, what the difference is in energy savings. And if you can even put a cost to it, that has always been tried and true best method that I've had for trying to implement certain sustainable strategies on my projects. But that's not always an option. Say you're building a home, small scale, low budget, then you might not have that opportunity. And I like the thought that you had, Gail, of in that situation you might bring in another homeowner that has benefited from a triple pane window and might be able to speak to that. The harder thing to speak to, I think, prove is the improved thermal comfort, because it's not so quantitative, just so very qualitative. So I think having input from another homeowner would be
Yeah,
quite
having a
helpful.
homeowner that goes, "Oh my God, I feel so much warmer in the house."
Yeah.
That window by my couch or whatever, like, yeah, that because people experience it every day, that discomfort potentially if they have, you know, depending on their house. So, yeah,
Yeah, I
I
think
agree that,
your first point, Sophie, is a really important one, that if you have visualizations, or simulations that actually demonstrate, there's lots of research in psychology that shows that is very effective using simulations and visualizations. So I would definitely say that for large buildings that you said you'd have that data. That's absolutely a good way to go. And I think you can probably think of some visualizations that help convey the comfort. I mean, I remember when I was in grad school, I lived in a place where the curtains inside the house would blow with the wind when the window was closed. So there's a good visualization to demonstrate the ineffectiveness of very inefficient windows. So I think there's ways to do it visually that would be very helpful in the individual homeowner case.
yeah, that's great. Should we move to yours, Sophie, or is there anything else you think we could uncover here?
I just have a quick follow-up question. Is we talked about finding a trusted like in-group source for homeowners. So the question is, if you're working with a project team, and maybe this is a question more for Tom and Sophie than for Gail, who would be the like in-group source there? Would that be a homeowner? Would that be um a builder? Like just thinking about different audiences for combating this particular piece of misinformation.
Yeah, while you're thinking about that, the in-group member is the member of the group you're trying to influence. If it's home builders or architects, then the in-group member should be the home builder or architect. If it's a homeowner, then the in-group member should be the homeowner.
I don't work
Yeah,
on so much on single family homes, but I know in the commercial space, in group would I can feel that designers really trust other designers, builders really trust other builders. So I think, say you're working with a contractor that is like really not sold on this concept, if they can talk to a colleague that has done it before, they're probably more likely to trust me as a designer. Um, from a homeowner's perspective, I think it probably depends who they trust the most in this process. I feel like individual homeowners are really individuals. That really depends on a case by case basis. But yeah, anyone have any other thoughts?
Yeah, what you have to do when you evoke that in-group status, in other words, you have to say, this is a homeowner just like you. We homeowners, so you can invoke the status by how you frame the communication.
Yeah, that's a good point, actually. I think if I'm, as a designer, even trying to work with a contractor, another way that I can put it is to create, I guess, our own in-group, talk about how we have the same mission, the same purpose, the same goals.
Yeah,
We're
and
in it
using just
together.
that we language,
Yeah.
we, designers, we design, we, a lot of we's.
Yeah. Yep. Cool. Are we ready for our next myth? Okay, so this one I had put together, and this is a myth that I hear all the time, that thermal bridges can't be that bad. The fact is that they are largely impactful. A thermal bridge, for anyone that's not familiar, is a more conductive element that cuts through your otherwise continuous insulation, thereby bridging cold temperatures from one side to the other. So let's say the wintertime condition, you're getting maybe a steel element that's bridging your cold exterior temperatures to your interior. And this is a problem for a lot of reasons. It can increase your energy usage, compromise thermal comfort by creating cold spots, and introduce the risk of condensation because now you have this cold surface on the interior and warmer air around it. So I think that the origins of this myth is that more sophisticated thermal bridging evaluation, like thermal analysis, 3D thermal analysis, is a relatively newer concept in the grand scheme of things, and many designers have been more or less ignoring a lot of the thermal bridging impacts for generations. And why start now? Because I hear a lot of this mentality with designing and building of, this is the way we've always done it, it's always worked out well. But in the case of thermal bridging, there could be issues with those thermal bridges that people have been designing with for generations that just went unrealized. Those cold spots that the building occupant was feeling, that no one ever really connected to those thermal bridges, or the increase in energy usage that no one was really tracking and no one was really noticing and no one really knew why. So the question is how to convince designers and builders and building owners to make thermal bridging evaluation and remediation a standard practice on all projects, considering the following. One, I didn't even put this down, but building code requires it, but I think a lot of folks still don't necessarily do it. Thermal bridges have the potential to increase heat flow through walls by up to 20 to 70%, according to the Building Envelope Thermal Bridging Guide by Morrison, Hirschfield, now Stantec, which that can, of course, significantly increase building energy usage. Thermal comfort is compromised, like we talked about, and the risk for condensation and other moisture issues. So that's my myth.
Tom and Sophie, I think your two issues are very similar, but Sophie's issue is even more complex to explain to everyone. It's extremely difficult, whereas Tom's issue goes into explaining the return on investment, and it's still difficult because people are looking at money now versus money tomorrow. So when I found and I tried to explain both of these, the thermal bridges with therm, that Phius is a very interesting class on that. Takes you 5 days of suffering, I would say. But then you understand how difficult it is to study thermal bridges. So I tried to explain with Roy, it didn't work. So you know what I did? I bought a thermal image camera. Cost me $250,
Yeah.
$300, and I showed it to students of a master class in architecture. Everybody wanted that. Everyone wanted to go and look through walls, and he showed it immediately how tough. What is the difference between a single pane window versus a double pane versus a triple pane, going from red to orange to green? And the same thing with thermal bridges. It's immediate. If you have thermal bridges, they are all red versus a wave of green everywhere. So I found it valuable.
So Ezio's idea is excellent because this sounds like an issue where people don't know as much about it. So you said it's a relatively new concept, Sophie. One thing that we know about when people don't have a lot of information already, that's when misinformation really can fill that knowledge gap. And so your idea is of reducing the complexity by using a very concrete illustration with the thermal imaging is an excellent way to go because that's like a visualization that people can see immediately. And then what you can do is you can backfill it after you have their attention and explain the concept and try and break it down.
Yes, because thermal bridges was so complex. People couldn't believe that nails were making such a big difference. But when you show it through a thermal camera, a thermal imaging camera, and you see all these, sea of red dots, they immediately got it. I mean, they said, "Oh my God, what are we doing?" And plus, Tom, the problem also with thermal bridge with the windows and triple pane is that they put triple pane windows and they fail to insulate the perimeter of the window. So they put that stupid batt like fiberglass. So it's also a question of construction guys and educating them. Education is key. They can do the best triple pane window in the world and then they fail when they got to the detail part of it. I did it with my own home when they installed the thermo-insulated entrance door, and they put the thermo-insulating batt around the perimeter. And I went there with my camera and I showed them how silly it was and how stupid it was.
It actually brings up an interesting point, is that you get a lot of true believers after they go through this process, like the builder's first passive house home, or like they're resistant, and then there's this ton of learning, and then in the end they're converted, because they actually saw like how good it could be. But that's a lot of work, like converting, like the conversion process is hard. I'm curious if there's other myths. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was gonna say we're running a little close on time here, but if there's one or two questions that someone would like to bring up, that would be great. We could cover those, provide some brief chapter updates, and then I can share that number for Phius CEUs or AIA credits for those who are interested in those things.
Hey, Alisa, can I just give a little opinion? Well, Gail, this was really, really wonderful, and thank you, Southwest Alliance, for putting this together. One quick thing that I was thinking as we were, as I was listening to the presentation, is that in New Mexico, I have to debunk constantly the fact of passive solar versus passive house, especially in relation to the embodied carbon energy that both of them have, with the conception that passive house uses a lot more foam or petroleum-based insulation, etc. But it was really, really great to see the sandwich. I couldn't. I'm still digesting most of it, but the sandwich was really great. Where I will state the fact that passive house achieves more consistent comfort and deep energy savings through air tightness and continuous insulation, etc. Warn about the myth that some claim that traditional passive solar with heavy thermal mass are more natural or environmentally friendly. Then I explained the fallacy. Thermal mass alone cannot prevent nighttime heat loss, for example, or summer overheating. And reinforce the fact that passive house integrates passive solar. Yes, that was a great thing, but also it controls a balance envelope, etc., etc. So yeah, it was really good. It gave me a framework to work with whenever I have to explain everyone about this.
Well, Xavier, if you were one of my students, I'd give you an A+.
Right. Well, thank you again, Gale, for your presentation, and thank you, Tom and Sophie, for sharing some misinformation that you've encountered, and for everyone for participating in that conversation. I'm going to share my screen really quick, provide just a few quick updates from us with the Phius Alliance Southwest Chapter Board on what we've been doing in the past year since we've gotten started, and what's coming in the year ahead, and then we will wrap things up. So we were founded as a chapter in the summer of 2024. Since then, we've had a couple webinars and now a third webinar today. And all of those are available and will continue to be available going forward on our YouTube channel, which is just Phius Alliance Southwest, so you can find them there. We also had the opportunity to co-sponsor a Cool Box Challenge at the College of New Mexico Central Campus in Albuquerque, and we've shared some news about that via our newsletter and on our LinkedIn. And Javier Obando is the one to talk to if you have questions about that and how that went. We have a chapter newsletter that goes out about once every month, and if you're interested in receiving those, I'll share the link to do that in just a moment. And recently, we've also launched state-level committees. So we're a regional chapter. Our board is spread out across 4 states. And so it's hard to organize in-person get-togethers and help you get connected with other passive building professionals in person. But if you're interested in helping organize local events with people you know or people you'd like to meet, please reach out. We'd love to have you join our state-level committees to help us organize these things. In the year ahead, we're going to continue to have meetings once every quarter or every 3 months that are the same format of some information, a webinar, coupled with some chapter updates. And the big news is that in 2026, PhiusCon, which is the biggest passive building conference in North America, will be happening right here in our region in Phoenix, and that'll be October 8th through the 10th. So stay tuned for future updates on what that will look like and how you can attend. We also recently had a few new members join our board as a chapter. Here you can see a list of people that are currently on the board. And as I said before, we'd love to have you get involved if you're interested. You can join a state-level committee to help organize local and in-person events. You can email the chapter, info@phiussouthwest.org, to share updates on passive building projects that you're working on that then we can share with our community. Please feel free to share ideas for future events and initiatives that you might find helpful in your work. And please feel free to share opportunities that you think other people would love to be involved in. So thank you all again so much for joining us today.